Hello, and welcome to South Shore Scoop. I'm Joe Collymore, and today we're visiting the Hingham Heritage Museum, which is home of the Hingham Historical Society. We're meeting with Eileen McIntrye, co-chair of the Education Committee. Hello, Eileen. How are you today?
Good morning, Joe. I'm well. How are you?
I'm great. Great to see you again.
Good to see you.
So we're here to talk about some of the exciting work that's taking place here at the Hingham Heritage Museum.
Yeah, well, actually, in this case, for the early part of this program that's coming up, it will be virtual, but this is the programming that in the near future from the Historical Society that is very important and tied to the acquisition of the Benjamin Lincoln House.
Now that's quite interesting because we know that there's been a lot of activity that's taken place around the Benjamin Lincoln House in terms of its acquisition and restoration. And so tell us a little bit more about what's coming forward here in this lecture series.
Yeah, so the Education Committee, of which I'm co-chair, are 6 people who've worked very hard on this. We started before COVID. We started when we were working together and finishing up the last lecture series. This is the 3rd annual lecture series of the Society, thinking about what the theme might be. And at that point, we weren't certain about the acquisition of the Benjamin Lincoln House, but we were quite hopeful. So we identified a number of themes associated with the lifetime experience of Benjamin Lincoln and his family. So we're talking about the 17th into the 18th century. There was a lot going on in Hingham and a lot going on in what became the new republic. And we have so much to learn from this period. So there's been some new study of topics and some, we're using experts who are knowledgeable about the period. And we have a wonderful array of programs in store.
You know, when we look at our circumstance right now, which of course forces a number of us throughout our society to work remotely, and especially in terms of homeschool, remote learning, this might lend itself, if you will, to those students who are working from home to be able to visit some of these remote lectures, these virtual lectures.
Well, absolutely. And we, over time, will make it available to the extent that teachers may want to make it part of their curriculum going forward. It will initially start out as a subscription series, and many in Hingham may have received this booklet in the mail. This is my copy that arrived in my mailbox yesterday. You've also probably seen these posters around town. And so the series begins this coming Sunday, so this next Sunday, the 27th, and it will all be available through Zoom. We're using Zoom webinar, and so those who have subscribed will have first access to this material, and it will go on through next May. We're hopeful that around March we'll be able to bring some of these programs into the museum. However, we will always continue with Zoom to make it as accessible as possible to those subscribers. And then, as I said, over time, more publicly available. We've talked with Harbor Media about making it perhaps a series that could air in the fall of 2021 as a compact series, and that will be so much more broadly available.
So when we look at subscribing, how does one do that? What website does the viewer go to?
Absolutely, hinghamhistorical.org, and all the posters have that on it. Also, you can use the information in the booklet and do it by mail, although we're coming up very close to the first lecture. You can call the museum, but the most efficient way is to go online to subscribe.
Now, I'm looking at the larger poster here, and I see some of the topics. And I'm going to quickly tick them off, and if you'd like to expand on any and all of them. Of course, leading off with Benjamin Lincoln and the American Revolution, a conversation with David Mattern. That's September 27th.
Yes, this Sunday, and I've been involved in planning that and rehearsing with David. Andy Hoy, who heads up social studies for the Hingham Public Schools, will be interviewing David Mattern. And in addition to running social studies, Andy also teaches U.S. history at the high school level. So he's a perfect person to do this. And David, who wrote this book, wonderfully researched book, which covers the full scope of the life of Benjamin Lincoln, but has a lot of really interesting information about how Benjamin Lincoln got involved in what became the Revolutionary War. Initially, he was just involved in the militia when we were a British colony and there was nothing going on between the colonists and the British. So how that transformation happened, not just for Benjamin Lincoln, but for the town of Hingham, which was somewhat divided in their points of view about the Revolution. So he really took on a prominent role. And so we'll trace that, but have a lot of focus on the Revolutionary War itself and how Benjamin progressed through that, the problems he ran into, and the successes he had, and then focus on that in the first lecture. And David will just be the perfect person to do that. He wrote this book some years ago, but those who are subscribing to the series have the option of buying a copy of it. It is still in print, and it's really a terrific resource.
And then coming behind that is getting to know Benjamin Lincoln's neighborhood in early October.
Yeah, so members of the Education Committee, we formed a subcommittee, really did a deep dive on those structures which are right around the Lincoln, North Street, South Street area that were standing during Benjamin Lincoln's lifetime, that are still standing today, and probe more deeply about what families lived there, what did they do for a living. And so they have prepared what will be online as a self-guided walking tour. In this world of COVID, we want people to be able to take this information and then take a walk into history, which you can do in this neighborhood. So we're looking forward to that.
I'm looking forward to joining on that virtual tour for sure. The next up is the evolution of Benjamin Lincoln's lifelong home.
Right, and we have an architectural historian who's going to talk about the details in this home and the transition it went through, the different styles of architecture as the home was modified during Benjamin Lincoln's lifetime. This parcel goes back 5 generations before Benjamin Lincoln. Thomas Lincoln, the Cooper first had, who was the immigrant in that line of Lincolns, first acquired the parcel, and it's gone through generations by the time it comes to Benjamin Lincoln, and then there were a number of modifications made. Architectural historians treasure the fact that we're going to make this a house museum because there's a lot of architectural study that can be done. Features that were maintained by this one family that maintained this home through all these generations since Benjamin Lincoln, features that you don't see typically in a home that has been lived in for this period of time. So that should be very instructive.
And then following that is the role of Hingham and New England in slavery and the triangular trade.
Very important topic, not simply because of the moment that we are in today, but importantly because of the moment we're in today. There has been some ongoing research for years by volunteers in connection with the Society, archives here, and importantly archives at the Massachusetts Historical Society, to see through deeds and wills and other original documents what we can learn about slavery here in Hingham. As some people don't realize that all 13 colonies had slavery as part of this original sin, really, of the British colonies here, and our economy relied on the slavery that existed first in the West Indies and then later in the South. There were slaves here in Hingham for quite a period of time until it was outlawed in Massachusetts during Benjamin Lincoln's lifetime. But the early census shows records of 77 slaves living in Hingham in the late 17th century. That was during the first colonial census. So we're trying to learn as much as we can about who these individuals were, put a light on the lives of people of color at that time. There were early on also Native Americans who were enslaved in New England and in Hingham. There was very early on some trade where Native Americans would be sold as if they were property in the West Indies in return for blacks who had come from Africa who were then also taken as property. We need to learn about that. We need to own that history and understand it. I think Hingham is justifiably proud of our period of abolitionist history, but we need to learn what came before that.
And then up next is education in colonial New England, schooling in a changing world. Now That title, that's quite interesting. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, and it was provoked by the fact that Benjamin Lincoln was one of the original trustees of Derby Academy, money left by Sarah Derby, who was instrumental in organizing the group that founded the school, Derby Academy. This building that we're in, called Old Derby by many people, was the second iteration in terms of structures that the Academy used. But because of his association with Derby, we looked at education as a topic, and Benjamin Lincoln himself received only what was called a common school education because he was being groomed to take over the family farm and malt house and orchards, not expected to go into law or medicine or ministry, for example, so didn't continue on for a college education, although he would later get an honorary degree from Harvard. So it was interesting to think about those times, the education someone like a Benjamin Lincoln would get, and then looking at how, depending on your position in the family, the kind of family you came from, whether you were male or female, education varied. And it was initially very much a family responsibility, and only the Puritans had some thoughts about it becoming more of a public responsibility. So we'll go through that evolution. Andy Hertig, who's on the education committee and taught for many, many years, will be probing that history.
Now, here's one that's quite interesting. Beer making in colonial New England.
Yes.
All right.
And I mentioned the malt house. So the malt house goes back to Thomas Lincoln time. So it had been in the Lincoln family for generations. We're not actually quite sure where the malt house was, whether it was adjacent to the home or on one of the other properties, the orchard area or the farm area that the Lincolns owned. So we're trying to determine where exactly the malt house was. But beer making was often a private endeavor. People made their own beer, but this was a commercial endeavor for the Lincoln family. And so we thought we'd take a look at how was beer made from barley. And we've got Barrel House Z is pitching in to tell the story. So it will be very interesting.
Next up is the complex worlds of colonial New England women.
Yes, and so Benjamin Lincoln married Mary Cushing. So Mary Cushing Lincoln gave birth to 11 children, not all of whom made it to maturity, but most of whom did. We thought it was particularly appropriate when we're talking about Benjamin Lincoln to think about his wife, also his mother, who had 9 children, and think about what the lives of women were like at this time. And so we have a wonderful historian and author who's going to take us through what the typical situation would have been for colonial women, the challenges and also the opportunities that their lives had. We will later, as the acquisition of the Benjamin Lincoln House is completed and we start programming, we'll probably later get some grant money to do deeper dives on the women in the Lincoln family. So this will just scratch the surface, but should be quite interesting.
And then we have Boston Light and 18th century New England lighthouses, which is just iconic here.
Yeah, well, this was a surprise for me when I read this wonderfully written book to learn that after the Revolutionary War, when Benjamin Lincoln, like many, including, he was a major general, many officers from the Revolutionary War, didn't have a lot of money coming in and hadn't been all that well paid from their endeavors as part of the Continental Army, and they needed to support their families. And so he was able to get a position as the collector for the port of Boston. And he was responsible in that role for the lighthouses, including Boston Light. That goes way back. And Sally Snowman, who's the first woman to be the keeper of the Boston Light, which has a different meaning today than it did historically. She's not sitting out there, lighting the lamps, but is extremely knowledgeable, wrote a PhD thesis on the history of Boston Light, and including, if I have a copy of that book, including correspondence between Benjamin Lincoln and Alexander Hamilton about the need to get money to pay the keepers of the lighthouses. In those days, Massachusetts included what is now Maine, so there were many lighthouses that had to be maintained or built or repaired, and the lighthouse keepers had to be paid. So lots of interesting history there. And we'll also touch on what the other lighthouses were that he was responsible for.
Eileen, this whole series, this whole lecture series just is so rich with lots of great information here. And the fact that you're using a virtual platform like Zoom, which hopefully makes it relatively easy for subscribers to be able to participate in.
Yeah, we're using this time Zoom webinar. For some people that'll be slightly different. We want to make sure, because we expect large audiences for many of these lectures, that everyone gets a good experience in terms of the video and audio quality. And so the best way to do that is to use Zoom webinar, so you don't have ambient noise from someone who may not have turned off their sound, for example. So there'll be some differences. People will enter their questions using a keyboard instead of voicing their questions. But we should be able to accommodate large groups for all of these lectures as a result. So even when we're back here, hopefully by March in the museum, that March program would be the beer making one. So that'd be great to be live with Russ when he takes us through that. We think that people will get used to this new format with Zoom, and we'll give them some basic instructions, and hopefully it'll all go well.
And again, what is the website that a subscriber can go to sign up for this?
HinghamHistorical.org, and the information will be in this brochure that most households in Hingham probably have received now, but feel free to just go to the HinghamHistorical.org website, and you'll see the entire subscription series there.
Eileen, is there anything else, perhaps in the form of add-ons, that our subscribers should be aware of?
Absolutely, and you'll see in the brochure in March, we have a special add-on performance subscribers can add to their subscription that really brings Sarah Derby to life. We have the head of History at Play, which is a wonderful theater company that does reenactments and impersonations of historic figures. And she has done deep study into Sarah Derby using resources we made available to her. And so she is going to become Sarah Derby for us. We're sitting today in the Hingham Heritage Museum here at Old Derby. So Sarah Derby's spirit is all around us. But this will bring Sarah Derby to life. And we'll learn more about the foundation of this coeducational institution, unusual for its time, not unique, but unusual. And Sarah Derby's contribution to education.
Eileen, it's always a pleasure to visit with you. You always bring some fascinating and new information that I didn't know before.
Well, it's an interesting town to study so much of our history as a country.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.